Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Demi of Demi Colton, and on behalf of Demi Colton and EBD Group, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Biotech Showcase and one of our pre-recorded events. Today, our topic is clinical research, a driver of success for the biotech industry and what's coming next. Our interviewer is Ed Silverman, who is a senior writer at Pharmalot with STAT. And he will be interviewing Jamie Macdonald, the CEO of Parexel. With that, gentlemen, I turn the virtual podium over to you, Ed, or chair over to you, Ed, to take this discussion forward.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's nice seeing everyone. Jamie, it's nice seeing you again. I want to start off by asking you what might appear to be an obvious question, but it's a very important and all-consuming question for more than a year now is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the CRO industry? And more important than getting us caught up on some of those changes, what do you see at least near term happening that's going to continue to force CROs to do business differently? And how will that take shape exactly?
Very good question. I think if we rewind back to sort of March 2020 and the historic way of doing business, a lot of that was in person. As an industry, a lot of our historical drug development involved a lot of in-person activity, investigators and patients, the monitoring aspects of trials, working with customers. Obviously, that all came to an abrupt change, and we had to adapt as an industry. Not just on the CRO side, but our partners and the whole ecosystem, including regulators and investigators and others. And it really forced change that had been really in the works for a number of years. So the adoption of technology, the ability to do things remotely, the ability to digitize some of the work that we were doing, looking at different ways of ensuring, first and foremost, patient safety. That was the priority in the early stage of COVID. And then really continuity of trials and then data integrity remained the priorities through the early part of the pandemic. We actually continued a lot of work in non-COVID related drug development as an industry. And you've probably seen yourself, there's been a number of approvals for new therapies in a whole variety of indications. I think that's been very positive. The adoption of technology will be something that stays with us post-pandemic. I think we're all looking forward to that time that we can say the pandemic is over and we're more into, I don't know, endemic or steady state environment where we're sort of dealing with coronavirus and COVID, but we can at least get some semblance of normality back into the way we conduct business.
I heard you say adoption of technology. What specifically were you referring to that characterized the past year and a half? Could you be a little more specific about what that looks like?
Yeah, so probably in a variety of areas. I think people are pretty conversant with the term decentralized clinical trials. So a lot of the work that was traditionally conducted by physicians where patients would visit the clinic or the hospital to conduct procedures and discuss clinical trials, a lot of that was done remotely. So think about the telehealth platforms, but also direct-to-patient shipments, patient-reported outcomes, quality of life indicators, the use of apps and mobile technologies in order to have patients be compliant and adherent to a protocol. And then on the other side, access to data. So electronic medical records, but also using technology to allow either sponsor companies or CROs to access data that allows us to ensure that protocols and procedures were followed, that data was captured, that patients are safe, and that the data is fit for analysis to determine conduct of trials, efficacy, and safety.
To what extent do you see this continuing? And is there anything beyond that that you think is needed to build on some of these changes?
I think many of the aspects will continue. I know we're going to sit down with a lot of our customers across a whole range, but particularly within biotech, and look at what are the things that did we do to adapt for the pandemic? How many of those are actually beneficial in a go-forward state? And should we continue to look at decentralized clinical trials? Because what we've learned is it does lower the burden on the patient to participate in clinical research. In some indications, that's actually helped with enrollment, patient participation overall. It's lowered actually dropout rates in some clinical trials, all of which is better for advancing clinical development in a safe and effective manner. So I think, yes, a lot of it will continue. Some of the other things have proven to be sort of complex. I think if we look at areas like at-home nursing, I think a great concept, but I think logistically it's proven challenging in a pandemic. We know that there is essentially a shortage of nursing staff globally for a variety of reasons. And utilizing that resource for at-home visits has not necessarily yielded the same sort of performance benefits as we would expect. And it can be done a little differently. We've also surveyed patients through advisory committees, and a lot of patients still want that face-to-face time with physicians or nursing staff as part of their sort of care or participation in clinical trials.
To what extent are these changes forcing CROs to re-examine their existing networks and alter them in some fashion? Is it more than numbers? Is it a certain type of investigative site, certain institutions or practices that may prove to be more desirable in this environment?
Yeah, really good question. I think what we've seen is that the pool of investigators globally is quite limited. So I think if we look at the data from the US, only 3% of physicians have ever acted as a principal investigator. I think what we've done in the pandemic is actually expand that investigator network globally. We've actually conducted research into some countries and regions that had historically been lower down the order of preference, if you like, for our customers. And we've realized that they do have access to patients that fit protocols. They are able to conduct high quality research. And therefore, I think there's maybe a greater willingness to look more broadly than just the traditional small pool of investigators that we quite often go to as an industry. I think there's a positive in the pandemic in that it's clearly raised awareness of clinical trials across not just the patient pool, but actually within the physician community. We've had a lot of physicians, hospital systems, and clinics reach out to us and say, are we able to participate in research? Yes, some of that is COVID-related vaccines and therapies, but even outside of those, we've had physicians reach out and say, what does it take to become an approved and qualified investigator for future trials? And I think that is a positive.
Those conversations could go in a number of different directions, of course. And I'm wondering if you're a CRO, what can you think about doing? What do you say to those physicians and physician practices that may have some of the pieces in place and have an interest, at least theoretically, in doing investigative work, but maybe they haven't done it already, and maybe they need some kind of assistance? Are CROs in a position to really move them down the track so they can fully participate? Or is this something that sounds great in discussion, but maybe too far off right now to fill the need we have?
It's quite interesting. I was at a call earlier today. It's a really good question because you clearly know the industry and really the barrier from going from being a good physician in clinical practice to being a qualified investigator. And there's a lot of infrastructure requirements, the need to have staff trained in good clinical practice, the ability to handle protocols, informed consent, all the regulations that go with it. There's actually a number of organizations, some of which are embedded in CROs, but some of which are independent, that are essentially providing site support and site management services where they can take essentially a naive investigator. So somebody who has good clinical experience, but not necessarily good clinical development and GCP experience, and provide them essentially the ability to become an investigator site in a confident and assured manner. They have coordinating staff, they have systems, they have tools, they're able to help with the administration. We've seen that particularly grow in the US, but we're starting to see that develop in other regions as well, which is, I think, positive for those that want to participate in research.
Sounds like there's a potential, if not opportunity, for new business and financial relationships there.
There is. I think the question is, should it be a gap that's filled by the contract research organizations, or is it really a different group of organizations that are focused on providing that service to investigative sites? It also extends out to other participants in our research field. So if you think about the US and the development of relationships with some of the bigger EMR providers, so whether that's Epic or Cerner or Allscripts or others, can they be brought into the ecosystem where they can help with things like feasibility, site identification? Where are the potential patient pools for a particular trial? That's increasingly important in areas like rare disease, because you really want to know what are the locations that I would need to activate investigators and sites in order to have patients at least close to those investigators, or with maybe pre-existing relationships with those investigators as well.
You mentioned rare disease. I want to ask you how you're viewing cell and gene therapies and how that's changing, how the CRO functions, because that's obviously very different than, you know, the other extreme, a Me Too diabetes pill, obviously.
Yeah, it has changed. I mean, rare disease drug development has been around for maybe 20 plus years. I think if we look back to the origins of companies like Genzyme, I think that gave us early insight into rare disease populations. Cell and gene therapies have some unique characteristics, particularly complicated on the logistics side. So therefore moving the investigational product or tissues or biopsies or other samples around and doing that in a very sort of safe and controlled manner. So that chain of custody becomes increasingly important. But I think the CROs have adapted that. It is very tailored, very bespoke. The cost of development is quite high on a per patient basis, but the clinical endpoints are really sort of positive, if you want to call it that. We know whether these therapies work very quickly. We understand the safety profile. And I think it's a positive for those suffering with genetic, sort of particularly genetic disorders. And so the science is moving very rapidly. The industry and the regulators as well are adopting new practices to make sure that those trials are governed in a very controlled way.
Mm-hmm. What additional new demands do you foresee on CROs as more of these therapies do emerge? Because it's almost the opposite, perhaps, of what we were just discussing, where we're thinking about widening the net of investigators and sites to physicians who have not yet participated in this work. Now we're looking at something extremely complex, as you were saying, and we need a lot of expertise, and that's only going to increase, right? So how does that affect the CRO going forward?
I think it does. I mean, you're always going to see development of drugs in different ways. Large cardiovascular studies look very different to very targeted therapies. Finding the right investigators is increasingly important. They've been able to know they have that skill and expertise. Training components on cell and gene therapy are pretty rigorous, even to the point we will see sponsor companies and CROs on site at the same time patients come in for screening and dosing. And that's a good practice that I think ensures the procedures are conducted exactly in line with protocol and best practices. And we've seen there's probably centers in the US of excellence that we know are particularly good at conducting cell and gene therapy trials. And the question is, can we ensure that we've got the support there to make them successful in delivering those trials for those patients?
I want to tackle another topic that is of increasing concern to everyone for a number of different and obvious reasons, the idea of more diversity in the composition of the patient pools, or globally, not just the US, of course. And I'm wondering how the CRO can affect that, because at the end of the day, a drug company publishes a study, and in the methodology, it discusses, of course, the approach taken to the protocol and executing the trial. And if there's some sort of perceived lack of diversity, that the sponsor, and it's the sponsor's trial, of course, they have, at the end of the day, that it's their name on the door. But the CRO or CROs are hired in that behind the scenes capacity to advise, not just execute. And I'm wondering about the extent to which a CRO can anticipate a problem and say, hey, look, you may have a great medicine that works well on this patient population, or you hope it does, but what about these other patient populations where we know there's also a problem with this illness, yet it looks like we may not have enough diversity to get results that can be more widely implemented. And all the reasons that flow from there. To what extent, again, does the CRO have an opportunity and a responsibility to look at that as the work is actually being played out?
Yeah, good question. So I think firstly and foremost, I think diversity and equity of inclusion is critically important. And I think it sort of starts up front in the planning phase. I think when we look at maybe feasibility and prevalence of incidence of disease, can we narrow down disease prevalence by ethnicity and race and other factors as well, and really build that into the design where we know we're going to investigative sites that have access to patients that fit into maybe the smaller pools of ethnic and racial diversity that are representative in that disease. We know from the history of drugs that certain medications have a different effect in different populations for a variety of reasons. A lot of that is down to genetics, but a lot of it can be down to diet and then other factors as well. So social environment, so social determinants of health have really become an important topic in designing trials. Where CROs can be involved is ensuring that the investigator groups are representative of the patients that we want to see enrolled in those trials. So it's really discussion about representative patient populations, not necessarily diverse patient populations, because we know some diseases are very specific to a particular group of ethnic origin or are more prevalent in a particular race. And therefore, you can't necessarily take the general population percentages and apply them to every trial. You have to really look at prevalence and incidence of that disease based on several factors. But there's been a lot of work conducted in the pandemic, and I think we've seen progress, but still a lot more to be done. I think it also involves the discussion around health inequities, and I think that's starting to be a more important discussion in general healthcare. And I think it's important that clinical research also looks at health inequities and how that affects the outcomes of patients, potentially in clinical research, but potentially also in terms of access to those therapies once they become approved as well.
Let me be very blunt, if I may. To what extent should the CRO, I don't mean to say play cop on the beat, but to say, hey, I'm looking at the protocol and maybe we should be looking at slightly different composition of patient groups here. Is that, do you see the CRO is playing more of an active, playing more active role in that way? Because that they're not the sponsor listed on clinicaltrials.gov, but there's an opportunity there to provide added value, right?
Exactly. To be a good consultative partner, I think we have that discussion with a number of customers. We're having it already. So it's not really the future, it's present state. If we don't do a better job ourselves, CROs and sponsors, then actually the regulators and or the government steps in. And I think that's not a direction any of us want to go. What is obvious, I think everybody is very minded and saying, yes, this is something we should do. we must do, how do we do it? So I don't think there's resistance there. I think the question becomes, how do you ensure that it doesn't jeopardize the timelines particularly, or the quality of your research? To have a trial delayed in terms of its readout on whether it's safe and efficacious and should be approved because you haven't necessarily found the representative patient population for that trial, I think is bad for everybody. It's not good to delay potentially beneficial therapies. It's not good that those therapies might not be tested in a representative patient population as well. So a lot of the discussion is around upfront planning. What do we think the patient pool should look like? How do we ensure we have the right countries, the right investigators, and the right institutions to give us that patient population and profile? So a lot of epidemiology, a lot of good feasibility upfront.
Okay. To change tacks, I know we don't have lots of time left, but we've seen some M&A activity in the CRO part of the world. And I'm wondering two quick things. Why do you think that is? And how much more should we expect? Where do you think this is headed?
Good questions. It's surprisingly how active the M&A market has been, not just on the CRO side, but biotech, pharma, elsewhere during a pandemic. It's amazing that people have got transactions done without a lot of face-to-face contact. It's probably been the natural progression for the CRO industry. It will move towards an oligopoly, pretty much like most industries, particularly service industries where you're not dealing with product differentiation. So I think it's really designed to bring benefit to our customers. If you're consolidating and you're not providing benefit to your customers, you probably shouldn't be consolidating. Yes, there's an investor component and everything else, but ultimately, most of these are designed to add value to our customers by accelerating development, doing better work, delivering better quality, bringing more innovation and digitalization, I think has been a big part of that as well. So we've seen one big merger of two CROs. We've seen one of our bigger CRO peers be acquired by a larger life science company. So that's been pretty interesting. We also have gone through an ownership transition. We've stayed private, but we have new investors with Goldman Sachs and EQT. Their thesis is the industry needs to continue to develop more efficient, more effective, and higher quality practices. It needs to adopt innovation, technology, and digitalization. How do we help do that with really a goal of adding value to the pipeline for biotech and our pharma customers? How do we help accelerate development? How do we move clinical trials through the system more efficiently? And how do we get to those true positive outcomes that good drugs are approved in as rapid a time as possible? So yes, it was going to happen. I'm an economist by training, so I always sort of assume there will be some consolidation.
Okay. So you're sharing your own personal forecast, in other words.
No, I think we like being independent. We like being private. Yeah, but it's good to have investors that want to make you a better organization. I think Parexel has continued to invest itself, but bringing in new investors and working with our customers to understand what is it that you're going to need from us in the future. I mean, really back to the questions you asked is, we're trying to understand, we do a lot of voice of the customer work. We also do a lot of work with patient advocacy. How do we become better for the stakeholders that rely on us to do good work?
All right. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate your time and your insights. It's been very interesting chatting about some of these issues today, and I'm sure there'll be more to come, and look forward to the next conversation.
Likewise, Ed. Thank you.
Thanks. Stay safe, everyone.